And good hello to whoever it is that's deciding to watch this video. This is LC Lupus, and we're going to be looking at Juri Lotman's codes. It's an aspect of literary theory that is especially useful for poetry. Now, before we start, just to say, I had always made these or recorded them in front of a whiteboard, but the whiteboard has actually become a bit of a nuisance. And so I sort of thought that actually if I just show up this screen, the screen is not going to change. So for those who like to, write down everything that's on the whiteboard, you can just take a screenshot or you can write this stuff down. But yeah, this should help with understanding Juri Lotman's codes. All right. So, Juri Lotman, we don't really need to know about the guy himself, but he was sort of a big figure in structuralism. Now, when it comes to codes, a code is very, very basically just sort of something that is within a poetic text of some kind. Now, a poetic text does not mean that it's just poetry. Poetics is a much broader term that can also refer to prose, like a novel, or could refer to a drama, what have you. But this is very, very much poetry-oriented in this particular case. So, a code are the different systems at play within a text that can help you to understand it in some or another sense. So we're going to go through all the main terms, the main ideas, and then we're going to also actually look at a poem and how we could, talk about this from a poetic perspective. Now, when it, in very, very basic terms, usually a lot of people will look at this from the intratextual, intertextual, and extratextual perspective, but we are actually going to start with the modeling systems instead. So, there are two main modeling systems that they talk about. So you get the primary and the secondary modeling system. So the modeling system is quite like basically what is the language or the system on which this particular poetic text is based. What is it modeled around? So the primary modeling system is the language that the poem is in, which seems quite obvious, but it is important to actually note this, right? A poem is written in a specific language. If a poem is in English, it can only really be understood through an English perspective. So that's why it's important to note what the language of the poem is. Then you get your secondary modeling system, which would be the medium in which it is. So if it's poetry, it's a poetry system. When we read poetry, we are paying attention to it in a way that's very, very different to if it were just ordinary communication. So ordinary communication would be, regular people just talking to each other, and people just talking to each other is not really something that is usually analyzed in the same way. Now, obviously, you do actually get conversational analysis, but we're not really going to look at that today. All right, so that is the sort of modeling systems. Now, if you're writing an essay about this particular theory, a lot of students will kind of just speak about intratextual, intertextual, and extratextual. They might bring up modeling systems, but they won't bring up any of the additional terms, which you'll see at the bottom part of the screen. Now, those are the very, very basic things: the intertextual, intratextual, extratextual. We are going to go over them, but you should not only discuss those, because those are really the most basic aspect of Lotman's theory. So, in very, very simple terms, intratextual codes are codes that are inside a poem. So think about it like the rhyme scheme that it uses, the words that it uses, how does it specifically lay itself out, etc., etc. Whereas an intertextual code is the relation between texts. Now, that can be confusing to some because intra and inter sound very, very similar, but try to think of something like, say, the internet, which is an interconnected network. So it's a like the internet isn't a thing. The internet is a whole bunch of computers wired up together. That's what it is. So it's actually multiple things that are sharing information between them. So that's what inter is in relation to intra. Then you get extra textual codes. Now that is something that is outside of the text. Extra textual, I think, is the easiest to think of because it's extra stuff. It's not actually in the poem necessarily. So sometimes this can be evident within the poem, but sometimes it's not necessarily, but it is researchable in some sense. So say, for instance, if a poem is set in a specific landscape, you might not recognize that landscape, but if you were to search the author, you might be able to find, oh, he actually grew up in this particular area, and so that's what he's actually talking about in this particular poem. See, so that's this idea of there being extra textual information that is outside of the that is outside of the rest of it. So that's why I say it can be evident. If a poem were to pretty much start with, this is set in Egypt, then it's probably set in Egypt. And you could learn something about the poem by going and having a look at maybe some stuff about Egypt to learn about it. See, so it can be evident or researchable. Any codes that are intratextual will be important because of their interrelationship with one another. Intratextual codes are very, very important because you want to understand how the different parts of a poem relate to every other part of the poem. Whereas intertextual is also important because you want to know, how does this poem relate to other poems? Right? And then extratextual, you might want to know more about the author, the setting, whatever. Now, what's very important, and I've written this on the side there is a focus on the interaction of codes within a singular text. How do they intersect with one another to produce meaning? Now, that is the main thing. These codes, these systems, work together to create the meaning in a text. That's what they do, right? Now, there is no such thing as only one of these. You can't have a poem that doesn't have intratextual features or doesn't have intertextual features. For instance, you only know something is a poem because you've seen poetry before. That's how you know it's a poem. So that is a thing that's worth taking into account, right? You can't know what something is if you've never experienced it before. So that is that's intertextual and also extratextual. That's why there can sometimes be a bit of a muddy distinction between intertextual and extratextual. It can happen. It can be a bit of a confusing thing. But in very, very basic terms, like if you're writing about this, say, in an essay, you should try to keep it quite constrained. All right, so these additional terms, you see there at the bottom there, is overdetermination, oppositional codes, foregrounding, minus devices, meaning saturation, and minimum redundancy. Now, these are like extra things. You could understand Juri Lotman's sort of codes without necessarily knowing these, but you'd be getting an incomplete picture of it. And if you're writing an essay about it, and you're only talking about intro, extra, and inter, you're missing out a lot of stuff. You're not talking about everything that you should be talking about. So, overdetermination is basically the intersection of codes. Now, what's actually a little bit irritating is that overdetermination and meaning saturation are kind of similar to each other, but just think of overdetermination as essentially like the most basic of these additional terms, because overdetermination just means that these codes intersect with each other, right? They lap on top of each other, so one is positioned over the other, over the other, over the other, and it's also generally in a sort of a non-hierarchical sense, which means you can't say that the intratextual aspects are more important than the intertextual. You can't say that. You don't know. It depends on the text. It depends what the text is trying to do, etc., etc. So, interesting. But that's what overdetermination is. It's just the intersection of these codes. And so if you want to understand a poem using Lotman's codes, you need to look at all the codes. You can't just look at one type of code. Now then you also get oppositional codes. Oppositional codes are basically those that are in some way juxtaposed against each other. So they're opposed, they're in opposition to each other. So think of any kind of sort of binaries and oppositional concepts. So if you were to have a poem that used the imagery of the natural world and the civilized world, let's say that, right? Those are considered to be opposites of each other. Now, you can argue, obviously, about what is and what isn't an opposite, but in terms of poetics, they are treated as opposites. So, why would a poem oppose these two concepts against each other, right? Because in that case, say if you're writing something about how the natural world is superior to the civilized world, which is what a lot of romantics did, if you were to do that, what you're basically trying to do is that you're using civilization to better define nature, and you're also using nature to better define civilization. You're defining each other through each other. So they only really make sense when they are together. There are other kind of binaries that exist, light and dark, good and bad, or good and evil. Any of these kind of things are oppositional to each other. They are juxtaposed against each other. So a lot of poems can use that kind of juxtaposition, that kind of oppositional nature. Oppositional codes doesn't mean that you use the word light and you use the word dark. It can be that, but it can also be imagery or metaphors or whatever. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, look, they use the word light here, and then they use the word dark. Like, that's not enough. Then you get foregrounding. Now, foregrounding is a concept that does come from, Russian formalism, but foregrounding, very, very basically, is whatever in a poetic text is brought to the front. Basically, it is brought to the fore. It is the opposite of something being in the background. So, for instance, if you're reading a poem, the language itself, like say, the language is not ordinary, right? Which means it is brought to the front. You really want to pay attention to the specific use of language. Language isn't backgrounded in the way that language might be backgrounded in ordinary communication between two people who know each other, right? If you and your friend are talking to each other, you don't stop to analyze why certain words were used while talking to each other. You kind of just carry on with it. So that's the idea of foregrounding. It is something that is brought to the front. And in terms of codes, there's kind of lots and lots of codes, but in poetic texts, these are the codes that are very, very important, right? Specifically the poetic codes, the poetic things that need to be brought to the front. So, why does a poem use rhyme? Why does it make use of rhythm? Why does it use blah, blah, blah? These are foregrounded. They're brought to the front. Now, the next one's quite easy to understand. It's called a minus device. This is an expected pattern that is then broken. So, imagine a poem that uses could use a rhyme all the way through. It's rhyme, and then no rhyme. Why did it do that? There's an expected pattern that has been built. Why has that pattern now been broken? And usually it's because it's something important, right? In say something like in a sonnet you get a thing called a volta. A volta is sort of the turning point in the poem. So a poem will be about something for part of it, and then it will switch at some point to essentially be about something else, but that's related to the last thing. So if you take a lot of, say, Shakespeare's work, the first, most of the poem will be about, immortality and beauty and whatever. And then the end of the poem, it'll have the switch, and it will now actually not be about that. It'll be about how, say, that's impossible. Like, there can't actually be true perfection and immortality. And so the poem will serve as a way of keeping that person immortal forever. You see, it's a point at which the poem stops being about what it was about, and it instead becomes about something else. So, however, that's also such a common device in sonnets that you might not even call it the minus device, but just as an example. A point at which the poem breaks the conventions that it had set out on its own. And this is also why you can get into issues also of like intratextual and intertextual, because, say, a sonnet, right, might make use of this Volta structure, where it suddenly switches its tone and what it's talking about. However, it does that, which, say to someone who's never read a sonnet, that might be unexpected from an intratextual perspective, but if you know poetry, it actually isn't minus device, because it's intertextually expected. So you can make arguments like that. You can say, well, there are, because that can be seen as something of an issue with Juri Lotman's codes. Like if you were talking about some possible criticisms of it, you could say, well, first off, intertextual and extratextual are often very similar to each other. Relation to other poems is also relation to things that are outside. Like it is extra and it is also inter. So, that's a bit complicated. You could say the same with like intra and inter, where some things are commonly expected. And so them being used is both intra and intertextual. So there are things you can make, like arguments you can make there. Now, anyway, let's look at meaning saturation. Now, meaning saturation is basically the use of sort of overwhelming meaning through the layering of codes. So basically, a poem has so much meaning because you're layering code upon code upon code upon code. Right? So that's why a lot of the time, in say when you study poetry in school or whatever, you will often get a teacher telling you that you can't just read a poem once. Right? You can't just read it. You have to actually go through it multiple times. You have to first read it, then you have to go through it slowly, and then you can read it again faster to now see all the codes intersecting with each other and what have you. Well, they won't use the word codes, but you know what I mean. So meaning saturation is basically saying there's now so much meaning that it's become sort of so loaded with meaning that every single line, every single word is very, very specifically chosen. And that's also where you get to minimum redundancy, which is the last of these additional terms. In ordinary communication, there's a lot of redundancy. So redundancy, right, is stuff that doesn't need to be there. Think about when you're talking to someone and, you say like these kinds of like filler, like words, Those are filler words. They are, they're redundant. But we obviously, in ordinary communication, we use filler words because, well, we usually need time to think. They're ways of helping us think or helping us stall. Right? Someone asks you a question, you go, yeah, It serves no real purpose other than to basically waste some time. So there's actually a lot of redundancy. Also, people repeat themselves, all sorts of stuff like that in ordinary communication. Or they talk too much. I mean, I'm sure you've met people who just won't stop speaking. They will just keep talking and talking and talking. And those people make a lot of redundant, speech. Think about somebody, imagine if you ask someone, what did you do yesterday? Now, most people would say, oh, yesterday I sort of, I got up, I went to work, had actually a really nice breakfast, and then I got back. See, quite simple. But then you get some people who, if you say, what did you do yesterday? And they'll go, well, I woke up at 5. No, it was 5:15 because I pushed the snooze button. Or did I push it twice? No, it was 5:15. Anyway, and then I think it was 5:30 actually. And if somebody spoke to you like that, you'd be like, wow, this is so much redundant information. I don't care what time you got up. Just tell me what you did. So, a lot of redundancy. Now, the idea in poetry is that it has no redundancy, or minimum redundancy. There's always some redundancy in the fact of humans make use of auxiliary words all the time. So these are words that don't necessarily add meaning, but they basically improve language in a sense. So think about if I was to say something like, I went to the shops. Now, you can actually remove the redundancies in that, and you can just use content words. So you could just say, I went shops. You still know what I'm saying. This is also why babies, or when people are learning language, they will speak like that, because they don't yet have the vocabulary to really stretch it out and make it more palatable. They're basically giving you the content without having nice form to it. So that form is still redundant. Like, you don't need it technically. It's just we prefer it. So a poem reduces redundancy as much as possible. Now, it will still obviously use things like, those kinds of terms, auxiliary words, and such. It will still use those, but it will use them for a purpose. Or if a poem were to use filler words, right? If a poem were to say, if a poem were to use those, it would be for a reason. Why is the poem using these filler words? What is the purpose of a filler word in a poem? Because every single line should have meaning. All right, now, let us look at a poem. Now, I've chosen a poem that I know quite well because I'm lazy, and that is Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. Now, this is a great poem. I like this poem. So, we're going to look at this in terms of some of those different codes. I'm not going to write the things on here. I'm basically just going to show the poem. As you can see on the left-hand side of the poem, I have the line number. On the right-hand side, I have the rhyme scheme. So, I will always just point towards, the specific line that I'm on. Now, that's the way you should always do things. You should first read the poem through. So I'm just going to read the poem through. I met a traveller from an antique land, who said 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level stands, stretch far away. Now, this poem is a very famous poem. It was published in the 19th century, and see, that is extra-textual information. But let's actually first, let's look at the extra-textual information first. So the extra-textual information might offer you some understanding of certain things, right? Who's Percy Shelley? Well, Percy Shelley was a romantic author. Romantic meaning romanticism, not romantic meaning lovey-dovey. So he often wrote about nature and beauty and all that kind of stuff. This poem is specifically about essentially the hubris of great rulers, and that everything that they accomplish will eventually be washed away with time. Ozymandias is a person you might not know. Ozymandias was a historical figure. It's known as Ramses II, I think it was Ramses II, who is often also associated with the biblical pharaoh from Exodus. But that's sort of, I don't know if that's actually historically proven or whatever, but he's often associated with him. So he was a great pharaoh, like a powerful king. That's who Ozymandias is. And this poem talks about a statue of him, and it's about a real statue, and the head fell off. So the head's broken. It's broken, like it's the actual face isn't perfect anymore. It's completely destroyed. And on the pedestal it says, my name is Ozymandias, and that he's the king of kings, and that you should look at everything he's created, look at everything and be terrified because of how powerful I am. And when you look around, there's nothing, because this was, thousands of years ago. Everything he accomplished is gone. So it doesn't matter anymore. So that's Ozymandias, right? But now you can see that's already some extra textual information that I've given you. The poem didn't tell you that Ozymandias was actually Ramses, whatever. It didn't tell you that. Another thing, Percy Shelley actually wrote this kind of in a friendly competition with a fellow poet, who also wrote a poem called Ozymandias about the same statue, which I can't remember his name. It's nowhere near as famous. But yeah, shame. But that's also a reason. You'd be like, oh, Percy Shelley wrote this because of a competition, like with a friend. Like that's quite weird little information to have there. All right, so those are extra textual. Now what about intertextual? Intertextual, remember, are the things that relate this to other poems. So this is a 14-line poem, which makes it a sonnet. So it's a sonnet. However, it has an unusual rhyme structure. It kind of looks a little bit apart because it goes A, B, A, B, which kind of feels a bit like it's going to be a Elizabethan sonnet, which goes A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. But it doesn't do that. It says A, B, A, B, A, C, D, C, E, D, E, F, E, F. So it's a sonnet, but it doesn't actually conform to a specific sonnet structure. So immediately, it's a sonnet. It shares some similarities with especially in the alternating rhyme that it does, but it doesn't have any couplets, so two that are next to each other that rhyme with each other. So it's kind of similar, in a sense, to a English/Shakespearean/Elizabethan sonnet, but it's not. So immediately you can see the intertextual aspects are that it's similar to a Shakespearean, but it's not a Shakespearean. It is a sonnet, but it's not actually, it doesn't fall into any of the specific types of sonnets that you get. Okay. So those are sort of intertextual aspects. And if you're writing an essay, that's what you should talk about in a poem. You should sort of look at the poem and say, well, what is this poem similar to? Is it similar to other poems, etc., etc.? Now we get to intratextual. This is the analysis of the stuff inside the poem. It starts off with one character saying, I met a traveler, right? So there's the poetic subject, the person who's speaking. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, and the rest of the poem is not the person, not the I, it's the traveler. The traveler is telling this story about this statue. So it's not actually about the I. The I could be Percy Shelley or could be someone else. But the traveler is a person who has come to speak. Now, I think that there are also people who say that this traveler might have been it's a real person. I can't remember exactly, but that's also extra textual information. And you don't need that information to understand the poem. So, you see, now it goes into dialogue. And dialogue is quite unusual in poetry, but you also don't see a response. You only see what they say, so it's more of a monologue. Right? But now they're talking about these things. Two vast and trunkless layers of stone stand in the desert. Right? So it's describing the statue. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. The head has fallen over, so it's a shattered visage. It's the head, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. All of those are describing it, so it's a lot of imagery. Now, also you can look at things here like cold command, and also later where it says lone and level. That's on line 14. Lone and level, and then sands stretch. And as I said, line 5, cold command. Those are all alliteration. Why does it use alliteration in these parts? So like a sneer of cold command has a certain feeling to it. Just like the lone and level sands stretch far away. Now that last line, the lone and level sands stretch far away, as well as actually line 13, which ends with boundless and bare. So there's actually 3 alliterations in a row. right? It said, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. That is sort of an ending, right? And it's ending on a very, very powerful note. It's wanting to end on something that is quite unlike the rest of the poem, because most of the poem doesn't use alliteration. You can also see on line 10, right, where it gets to the, and on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. That is a minus device. It was, because that is not actually dialogue. That is the person who is speaking, reciting something. So he's reciting a description, something that's written on the statue. So it's a minus device because it breaks the expected pattern, right? Because it was a person talking, and now they're not talking. They're reciting something, and then it goes back to them talking. So that is a minus device. Now, when it comes to like foregrounding, a lot of these aspects are foreground, like the fact that it is dialogue is very much foregrounded because it's not something you will necessarily expect in a poem. And the way that it is in many ways describing something in some detail. It's saying, that there's a too vast and trunkless legs, shattered lip and sneer of cold command. It says that the sculptor understood these things. Those are foregrounded as sort of imagery. See, so, and then also, of course, there is a very, very big oppositional code here, right? Look at the poem. It's sort of talking about how the statue is absolutely destroyed. It's just devastated. There's nothing. It's like it's broken. It's old. It's fallen apart. And then on line 10, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. But there's nothing there. There's nothing. There is an oppositional code here where it's saying, look, it's first talking about how there's nothing, and then the king's words are saying, look at all my great everything, look at what I've made. And then it reminds you for the last 3 lines, there's nothing there. At all. And that is pretty harsh and depressing, but that is an oppositional code, which then makes you understand what the poem is trying to say. This person, this king, Ozymandias or Ramses, had such power and saw himself as so powerful, but that got stripped away, and now there's nothing because time destroys all of our accomplishments. So that is an oppositional code that helps you to understand the meaning of the poem. And as you can see, all of these now work together, right? As like I said, there's the interaction of all these different codes with each other. So that is the important thing to take away from this, that all of these codes work with each other to help you to understand the poem itself. Right, so this poem has oppositional codes, got foregrounding, got minus device. Meaning saturation is always in a poem because every line is important. And then minimum redundancy. For a similar reason, there's no redundancy here. The poem says what it needs to say and then it ends. Like line 14 ends this person speaking. You don't get to see who he was speaking to and how that person responded to what was said. You don't get to see that. So it doesn't matter in that sense. And that is Juri Lotman's codes. Hopefully that does make sense. Now, if you're writing an analysis, you shouldn't analyze this poem. Analyze a different poem. Do your own poem. Show that you can do it. It's really not complicated. Go through it line by line and try and check out the intertextual things. You can also, remember, you can research a poem and be like, let me find out some extra textual information about it. Let me see what other stuff I can find out about it. Count how many lines it is. Check the rhyme scheme. Is this something that's related to other poems? Is it a sonnet? Or what if it's another poem? Is it like a free verse or blank verse? Or is it an epic poem? What is it? That relates it to other poems. And then intertextual, analyze it in depth, and then look at those additional terms. Overdetermination, oppositional codes, foregrounding, minus devices, meaning saturation, and a minimum redundancy. You can find most of these in pretty much most poems. Not necessarily, especially a minus device, but try to find. And also, if you're writing an essay for university, you should also talk about you should explain these things. Remember, you explain the thing, and you must give an example. You can't just explain it in the abstract. You need to actually link it to something real. Talk about an actual poem. And that has been our look at Lotman's Code. So, if you did enjoy this, or if it was helpful, whatever, please do the usual things like comment, subscribe, share, do that kind of stuff. Also, if you're interested in supporting the channel in any way, you can also check out my books. I'm one of those writer people. So, I have a new book coming out soon, but for now I'm just going to show Parked In, which was the last book I wrote, which is a story of a very, very sweet parking space, as in the thing you park your car on top of. And this parking space is just a lovely person. You know, they're nice. They're a nice person. And they don't really understand humans. And the book, it's a novella, is sort of about them trying to understand humans and to understand the world. So if that sounds interesting to you, go have a look. It's in the description. And so that has been LC Lupus. And I hope that otherwise you have a great day, week, and month ahead. And goodbye.